Welcome to My Brother's Keeper again, the program that is looking at the threats to Christian communities throughout the world, really. We have so far been looking at the situation in the Middle East and also in Africa. But today we turn our attention to Western Europe, where the threats are quite different, and the controversies are different because you don't have the same situation in which the Christians are a minority. We'll look at a sense in which they are a majority, and also maybe there are minority aspects to the Christian identity in France today. I believe there are. But let me turn to my colleague, Virág Lőrincz, and ask her, give us the current breakdown demographically of Christians and non-Christians in French society.
Yeah, taking a look at the demographic landscape of the French society, we can see that it has over 60 million people, and out of that, the population of Christians is around. It's more than the 60% of the population is Christian, and the Muslim population is around 7 to 9% of the population.
Now, the question of Christians being 60% or more of the population, that doesn't seem to be true if you look at politics, so to speak, because the number of political parties which are friendly to Christians is quite small. There has been, since the French Revolution, and certainly since 1870, a strict secular regulations, hasn't there, in French politics and society? Perhaps you could give us some idea of what that is.
It's important to note that in the French Constitution, there is a principle for secularism. The French word for that is laïcité. Sorry for my pronunciation. Obviously, I'm not an expert on constitutional French law, but it means that the state and the church is separated, and it means that the state doesn't want to participate in the church issues,
and it equally doesn't want the church to have too much influence on political issues either. It wants religion and politics and public affairs really to be kept in very strict different compartments, I think.
So, for example, if we compare this secularism with the case in the UK or in the USA, in those countries it's much more common for the political leaders to try to appear together with the church leaders. But it's not the case in France.
And of course, that particular attitude seems to be increasing, doesn't it, in some countries? For example, Ireland, which was indubitably a Catholic country, more than 90% of people used to go to Mass on a Sunday, and that's only about 20 or 30 years ago. But of course, today, the Christian Catholicism is very much on the retreat, and quite aggressive secularism is beginning to take its place in Irish society, and that's been the case for a long time, I think, in French society. So the question that next arises, and I'm going to turn to Geoffrey for this, is to say, if laicite has had problems with Christianity for coming up to 150 years at least, what problems is it likely to have with Muslims?
In Islam, there is no separation between religion, politics, private life. It's a deen. It's a way of life. And so when you come into a Christian majority country like France and you're being asked to make that separation, it is difficult, if not impossible, because to accept one is to deny the other. And so what's being asked of Muslims as a minority community, in some ways, is the inverse of what we've been talking about in the Middle East and Africa, where Christians are a minority and being asked to conform to Islamic standards.
In which case, do we know of cases in which that has proved to be a major problem? Let me suggest one of them is the headscarf.
Yes.
Would you like to just talk about that for a moment?
Sure. The hijab law which is controversial even for the French, in that young girls going to school are asked not to wear the headscarf or not to wear any form of Islamic dress, which for some is fine, but for conservative women or girls from conservative families, it's like being asked to not only deny your religion, but to make a very fundamental attack on the morality and the values of that family, because anywhere in Islam, the honor of a family is invested in its women.
Now, how large a percentage of the Muslim population would react in the way you're suggesting a very pious Muslim and his family would react?
Well, we don't really have numbers on it, because what we're able to measure are actions. And the actions of girls being held out of school or creating great problems is not that great. So we're not sure of how deep this is. Let me make a comparison, though. You brought up Ireland. And we've completed our field work, for example, in Poland some time ago. And there you see another primarily Catholic country, but one that has no tradition of secularism. And lacking a large Muslim minority, the pressure on the Muslim community there, small as it is, doesn't exist as it does in France, because there's room in the public square for expressions of religiosity. And to block these expressions of religiosity in the Islamic world, in France, is asking a great deal, not only of Muslims, but also of Jews who identify as well, especially the Orthodox or the Haredim. You have Christians who would like to wear Christian symbols. And are they allowed to? So there's a range of questions that don't just affect Muslims.
No, they don't. And they've, in fact, some of those have affected Catholics before. There was a great dispute in French society going back to the turn of the 20th, from the 19th to the 20th century, about control of education and church schools and so on. The question we would have to ask now is, to what extent is that repeating itself, and to what extent Christians feel that they were disadvantaged by laicite themselves, and has that produced any kind of a fellow feeling between the Muslim and the Catholic communities, remembering that the Catholic communities are not the 60% of the population. I mean, they are nominal Catholics, but how many of them go to church? How many of them are active politically in a Christian sense? They promote Christian issues. They're important questions. And what guidance does the Christian experience of laicity give the Muslims?
I think, not to disagree, but I think we may be setting an unfair standard here, in that in most countries, people who have even deep faith don't bring that into the political arena and support political parties that have a platform dealing with Christian issues. They divide politically along very much the same lines as their secular countrymen. So I think we may be setting a standard here of analysis that simply doesn't hold up.
I would have to say, on the basis of what we know about, for example, Britain, there are parts of Britain. Northern Ireland is one, but until recently, so was Glasgow in Scotland, so was the city of Liverpool, in which politics was very much determined by religion. The Conservatives had organisations, clubs, for example, which were Protestant working men's clubs, and Labour was supported by Catholic Action, which is a Catholic political organisation. Now, those things, which were still realities, social realities, when I was growing up in Liverpool, they have more or less disappeared completely. I would say they were killed in the Second World War, and that they have, in a sense, they died completely by 1970, say. Mm-hmm. Now, what about France?
Why would France be any different? Changes. It's a much vaster country. It's a much more diverse country. It's not as in Ireland, where you have an overwhelming majority who are traditionally Catholic, identify themselves as Catholic, not only for the religion, but also to block out the other, in other words, Britain. And I don't think France doesn't have that situation. France is really something different because there's a large Muslim minority. They are very much separate. They haven't been accepted into the Christian mainstream or into the French mainstream. I'm not sure how much they want to a degree, but this kind of assimilation is not really possible. So you're not only looking at a religious difference, you're also looking at a racial difference. You're looking at linguistic differences, etc. So the situation is vastly different than in a place like France or the place we studied, Poland.
Yeah, I would like to add that what you just said, that whether this secularism can make something like it can create similar feelings between the Christians and the Muslims. And so secularism means also that, as Jeffrey mentioned, that, for example, the civil servants or teachers cannot wear these, like whatever they want, which would sign which religion they belong to. But it can have an effect on both communities, on the way that you were just referring to, because historically this secularism basically was, I don't want to use the term against, but it was because of the Christian church. However, as the Muslim population is growing, it tends to have that feeling that it is against, or it is because of the growing Muslim population.
I want to question, by the way, the figures. Just raise about the Muslim community in France. It seems to me that what was the percentage of the population that identified as Muslim?
It was estimated 7 to 9% of the population.
I think maybe this is the result of the fact that that community is clustered in and not spread evenly, but that seems to me to be a considerable underestimate. I would guess the figures are more than that, or maybe they are determined, and I think this is worth looking at, whether or not somebody is Muslim is determined by a civil servant who, but frankly, what is the basis of that determination? How do we know that? Because it seems to me those are, if you look at the situation in schools in Paris and other major centres, particularly in the south, Nice, the population there seems to be considerably larger than 7 to 9%.
Well, if you look at places like Marseille, certainly. If you look at Paris, absolutely. I think there are two issues, and these are the numbers that are publicly available. I don't think it's a matter that some civil servant has arbitrarily assigned these numbers. I think it's much more a matter of how many are there you are able to count, how many are legal, how many have immigrated illegally, and those numbers we don't know. We go to France and we tend to be in the urban areas. And so the numbers look huge. But as you go into the countryside, into the villages, not so much. So I don't know how valid those numbers are, but I think those two issues, urbanization and the number of illegal immigrants, has a lot to do with your perception.
Well, that may be the case. I agree. At the same time, the anxiety of the French authorities over, for example, young they think of them as Muslim men. I think the les beurs is the phrase that is popularly used in the suburbs around major cities, and the feeling that France has lost control, so to speak, of public order in those areas suggests a much bigger problem. And to what extent, for example, we know in Sweden it is a serious extent. Do Christians who live in those same areas feel that they are now living in a Muslim society? Do they feel? I mean, that seems to be the case, for example, in certain suburbs or cities like Malmo in Sweden. Is that the case now in France? That let us say middle class and working class Catholics find themselves living in a society which they don't themselves recognize as French?
Absolutely. France is interesting in that in Sweden, you don't see this kind of strict separation, where it's much more possible to assimilate into Swedish society. And Sweden is nothing if not open-hearted. They support these communities with incredible resources and give them access to put not only resources, but political power in a way no other country in Europe does. France has a situation where you have two communities that are separate. And that separation leads to a hostility because one is not only well entrenched, I mean, they generation after generation have lived in these cities. You have a relatively new population who have not been allowed to become part of that mainstream. They are vastly different in terms of economic resources, in terms of educational opportunities, etc. So they live in a kind of angry isolation, which isn't unique to the Muslim-Christian divide in France. You see the same thing in inner cities in America. You see it in Britain.
Yeah, I would like to add that this kind of separatism is indeed a challenge. And it is proven by the fact that in recent years, there was a anti-separatism bill, which was meant to be somehow try to solve this problem. And if I recall it correctly, it included elements like emphasizing the prevention of hate speech because of the strong oppositions between these communities.
Because of the rise of parties like the National Front and other parties.
Yes, and also it had elements regarding the organizations and churches. So they wanted to have much more somehow to monitor the activities, and also they wanted to have some kind of influence in those organizations, which, for example, in those religious organizations, for example, which have founding from, for example, a foreign country. So there are intentions.
Now, it seems to me that those that kind of intervention by the state, passage of hate crime laws, that's part of the management of a society by its political class, in order to deal with the tensions that arise between groups. And now I'm thinking of I'm asking about a slightly different question, which is, do we see the people at the bottom of the heap, both Muslims and Christians, talking to each other now after some years of this kind of experience? Because there is another separatism in French society which in the last two elections has received a lot of attention, and that is the separatism between the France that really counts in Paris and major cities, particularly ones which have built their success around knowledge industries, communications, and so on, the universities, that society, and the peripheral France, the France that gets no attention, that is obviously in a rebellious mood because, for example, the Gilets jaunes are seen as the lower middle class rebels from societies that are, so to speak, excluded from decision making in France. Now, do we see this kind of development, the resentment of the lower, of the uninfluential political classes, middle class and working class? Do we see any sign that that is bringing different ethnic and religious groups together again in a rebellion against the top?
It's a very good question. This is something that will be determined by research and fieldwork. But the thing that really mitigates against it is the level of violence that is going on between the communities. Specifically, radical Islam has grown tremendously. In, I think, 2021, there were recorded over 800 attacks on Christian institutions. There have been attacks on churchmen and congregations. And the radical right of France has, for a long time, attacked Muslims, attacked immigrants. So there's a level of violence going back and forth that has been unmanageable.
Well, what kind of figures do we have about the attacks on the immigrants and about and attacks on, for example, Catholic priests or from radical Islamists? What are the numbers on both those kinds of violence?
The numbers on attacks on the Christian institutions are much better documented. And the reason they're better documented is something you see around the world, which is they report it. A church is burned, you can't not notice that. And a churchman is attacked, it's obvious he's going to call the police. The people who are in the reverse position have been beaten by skinheads first, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, or radical anti-migrant believers, football hooligans, you name the spectrum. They tend not to report. And why? First, they don't think the police care. And to a degree, that's probably right. More than that, their documentation or family documentation may not be in order. So for a number of reasons, they underreport. So the numbers are speculative and depends on who's doing the reporting.
Now, I don't want to minimize in any way the plight and difficulties of the Muslim community in the way what you've just said, Jeffrey. I don't want to do that. But I do begin to ask the question, therefore, do we find since we're looking particularly at Christian, in this case, the majority that may be really a minority as well, that is to say, ordinary Christians who attend Mass, many who don't, but who nonetheless are in a social situation in which they're excluded from influence in the society. Mm-hmm. Do those people feel attacks from the Muslim Islamic radicals on the one hand, and the indifference of the secular authorities, the political parties, to their plight? Are they being squeezed in two directions in a way that is making them more radical, less radical, passive rather than radical? What do we think of that?
I think that here we have to mention a very important aspect regarding research is the terrorist attacks and the radical Islamic presence within France since especially after 2015. There were several terrorist attacks. And I think that it somehow drew the attention of the public to the situation of Christians, not just Christians, because there were attacks which were not targeting Christians only, but there were attacks especially against Christians. And I believe that it drew the attention of the public, especially to the case of radical Islamic perpetrators against Christian victims.
And on the other hand, to go along with what Virág is saying, and to respond more directly to you, if this had happened years ago, I think you would have gotten a much different reaction by the overall French public. But you also have to factor in the church scandals, the alienation from the Catholic Church, and the increasing wave of secularization that is simply global. among educated elites.
Which was one of the reasons why I question the identification of 60% of the French people as Catholic, because many of them have drifted away from it, and some have specifically rejected
Well,
it.
they have, but when the census is taken, this is how they self-identify.
Yeah.
There's no test to say how faithful a Catholic you are. It's simply they identify as that. The numbers that really struck me in France is how low that is.
Yeah.
That it's 20 some percent who identify themselves as atheist, or they just don't care.
Now, we don't quite know the disposition of those people in terms of power, but let us look at Christian women. Now, I do think they face, do they not? Tell me if I'm wrong, a specific sort of problem, which is to say, if they live in areas that used to be straightforwardly Catholic, atheist, agnostic France, and now it's a mixed area, and particularly one that may feel it's being taken over by a nearby Muslim. Do their lives really change significantly and for the worse? Young Christian women facing sexual harassment. How serious is that?
I think that we should look not just first of all, not just to the situation of women, but also the situation of those people who are being converted from Islam to Christianity, because it is an existing phenomenon in France as well.
Yeah.
And here we only have also estimated numbers, because there can be situations when they don't want to reveal their face openly. And it's very difficult for them, like, first of all, to leave the Islam religion. I mean, it can be difficult. And also they actually do suffer some kind of, some soft forms of violence from, for example, the side of their families, if they don't accept their conversion.
And to follow up on what Virág said, perhaps a good way to close is young women feel themselves very much in danger when walking in these communal areas, when they are minorities. But you see this throughout the world in cultures of poverty. Women are simply vulnerable. They're not dressed in the same way. They don't act in the same way, and they become thus targets. Are we talking about a Christian-Muslim issue, or are we talking about cultures of poverty?
We may be talking about both, and I think we may have a problem here of belonging. We have people who feel they're losing the society they grew up in, and others who feel that they've arrived in a society which isn't theirs yet. Big problems. We'll be returning on a later occasion at My Brother's Keeper to discuss how they're going to work out.
For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.